Hello, everyone. Hello, beautiful day. Thank you all for being here on such a lovely weekend and I know a very busy weekend, so we really appreciate you all being here today. Welcome everyone for being here, and to those at home, we welcome you as well as we kick off our 2025-2026 lecture series, Revisiting the American Revolution, Part 2. My name is Jim Taylor. I proudly serve as the chair of the board of directors of the Hingham Historical Society. And first of all, I'd like to please join me in welcoming Deirdre Anderson, the executive director of the society. Yes. Her team, all the volunteers that put this lecture series together, it's really a labor of love and really a lot of hard work, and we really appreciate all you and your team do. So thanks again, Deirdre. Just a few programming notes before we begin. On Sunday, September 28th from 11 to 4 is the Society's annual pilgrimage to historic homes, our 99th historic house tour. Can you believe it? 99. Yes. Keeping with our Rev 250 theme, this year's tour features 7 private homes, 6 once occupied by American Revolutionary War patriots, and 5 public buildings, including our own Benjamin Lincoln House and the Old Ordinary. If you have never experienced a house tour, they are self-paced opportunities to visit Hingham's historic and incredible assets. Spend as little or as long as you like visiting the properties. Tickets are on sale now, and this is a tour you don't want to miss. I would like to put one plug in as well. Many of you received on your chairs a sheet of paper here. We'd love to have folks help us out and serve as docents for the house tour. So let me just explain what that entails. Basically, you either sit or stand in one of the homes on the tour, and you greet visitors as they enter the room using a cue card. You share 3 or 5 points or so about the history of the house, the architecture, the decor. No experience necessary. Just bring your hospitality. See, people are already calling in wanting to join. See? The demand is amazing. So we have both morning and afternoon shifts available. And as a docent, you receive discounted tour tickets and really the satisfaction of giving back. If you're interested, please contact Gail Litchfield or Deirdre. We're happy to set you up and would love to have you join us that day. And we would really appreciate your help. Another programming note, where also we have an opportunity for volunteers, is Wednesday and Thursday, October 8th and 9th. We will welcome 300 11th graders. This is a Hingham High class of 2027. Maybe you need to be a little more of a heartier soul to participate in that. They're going to be coming to our properties as they kick off their year-long study of American history. This field trip to the museum, as well as the Benjamin Lincoln House, the Old Ship Meeting House, is really a culmination of much of their previous field trips to our properties. So it's a really important opportunity for the 11th graders to learn more about American history and what goes into it. We would love and we would really benefit from 3 or 4 volunteer hosts for each of our properties between 8 and 2 on that Thursday or Friday, as we welcome them and direct them to various stations within those properties. So once again, please contact Deirdre if you're interested. We'd love to have you help and volunteer. It's really a great way to give back to the community. With that being said, it's now my pleasure to introduce my fellow board member, Bob Roncalli, who'll talk a little bit about the Society's commemoration plans and to introduce today's speaker. Bob.
Thanks, Jim. I'm a volunteer director here, and I serve on 2 subcommittees of the Historical Society, one being operations and the other being programs. The Society is very proud to have a leadership role in planning our town's participation in the state's 250th commemoration efforts. In the past year, many of you have participated in our events, starting with subscribing to the Speaker Series 24-25. April, we had the bus tour to Lexington and Concord, May was the weekend, the Revolutionary Weekend, where Springham was Saturday, and Sunday was the reenactment of the Battle of Grape Island. And we had the Hingham Militia there performing. In anticipation of more tourists visiting our historic town in the Rev 250 year, we've partnered with the town and the state to enhance visitors' downtown experience. Our efforts really honor the rich history alongside Greater Boston Revolutionary history. I worked with the team that oversaw the Old Ordinary changes this year, making it accessible, accessible bathrooms, and new walkways that are accessible, little kitchenette. And this fall, oh, and excuse me, that was, generous grants helped us do that. Mass Office of Travel and Tourism had a grant. We benefited from the Hingham Community Preservation Fund and from a grant from the Greenbush Trust. This fall now, we're going to see a change in a reconfiguration of Fountain Square. And if you don't know what Fountain Square is, it's the little island that has the statue of Benjamin Lincoln that sits across from the Benjamin Lincoln House. This is in coordination with the town and our friends at New North Church. The purpose of it will be to make pedestrian safety and traffic safety. And again, we are very happy that we've had a Mass Department of Transportation Shared Streets program give us a grant. And that was a lot of work by the town to obtain that grant. So, and today, now let's get down to the business of what today, and we have a great crowd considering the Patriots are playing right now. So, we're really proud to have a scholar today who's going to who has focused on the American Revolution. So Jack Warren has over 34 years of professional experience as a historian, a writer, editor, and senior executive for cultural organizations. Editor-in-chief of the American Crisis, a journal of history and commentary, and a founder of the Foundation of American Ideals. He served 18 years as the executive director of the Society of Cincinnati and was the founding director of the American Revolution Institute. And incidentally, our Benjamin Lincoln was the president of the Massachusetts chapter of the Society of Cincinnati from 1783 until his death in 1810. Jack was a key supporter of the Hingham Historical's efforts to secure the Benjamin Lincoln House in 2020. He wrote and generously provided copies of a great article, not this, but this, Benjamin Lincoln at Home. Many of you may have already read this or seen this, but what we had to do was not only raise the money to purchase the house, but raise enough money to provide the endowment for the house. His books include The Presidency of George Washington, America's First Veterans, and Freedom, the Enduring Importance of the American Revolution, which I think Jack lives in Alexandria, Virginia with his wife Janet, and we are really, it's my privilege, and we're very happy to welcome you here today, Jack.
I'm astonished and I'm flattered that you couldn't think of something better to do on a beautiful day like today. I hope your time is well spent. Almost 200 years ago, not 250, I'm not got things too far off. Almost 200 years ago, a man who lived in Washington, D.C., whose name was Roger Waitman, wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And he invited Thomas Jefferson to come to Washington from his home in Charlottesville to participate in the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of 4th of July, 1826 in Washington, and wanted Jefferson to be the city's special guest. Jefferson was very ill, and in fact, he was ill from the disease that would take his life on the 4th of July, and he knew that he couldn't travel. And so he wrote back to Waitman. Really it's his benediction in life. And he says, look, I can't come. I'm too old, I'm too sick, I'm too broken down. I would love to be with you and with that remainder of that band of worthies who took this great chance with me to declare our independence. And he says, that was the personal part. But then Jefferson did what Jefferson does. He generalizes. He says, look, let the annual return of this day should inspire the world. He says, what we did on the 4th of July, 1776, will be, he says, I'm convinced, there's a certitude in his tone, he says, will be to everyone in the world, it's some people later, some sooner, but eventually everyone, a call to throw off tyranny and oppression and to embrace the benefits of self-government. He says, all eyes are open or opening to the rights of man. And then you can see Jefferson is a funny writer, and sometimes you see his emotions getting control of him, even though he's a very orderly writer. And he says, he says, I hope that it will be to mankind, the annual return of this anniversary, a reminder to throw off the yoke of tyranny, of monkish superstition and ignorance. He said, the world is awakening to the palpable truth that no man was born with a saddle on his back, and no other person booted and spurred by the grace of God entitled to ride him. And he closes with a sort of thanks for inviting me, can't come. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's very Jeffersonian. About the same time, and of course, this was a letter that Jefferson had received from a person he didn't know, Roger Waitman, a stranger, inviting him to come to a distant town. A town Washington, that Jefferson knew, but, Washington in 1826. It was a muddy village. It was really, even 20 years after Jefferson had been president, it was a miserable place in many ways. That's a native speaking, by the way. I'm allowed to say that. It was proof, one contemporary said, that you cannot create a great city at will. It is a miserable place of streets without houses and houses without streets. And it remained that way for a very, very, very long time. It isn't that anymore. But about the same time, a delegation of the residents of Braintree, now Quincy, of course, went to visit John Adams. I love the contrast in that they came personally. And they said, they knew, you see, because unlike Waitman, who really didn't know Jefferson and didn't know the state of his health, they knew that Adams was quite elderly and ill and broken down, and that there was really no chance that Adams was going to come out of his house and participate in the 4th of July festivities there in town. But they were calling upon him, and they were really calling upon him in many ways as an act of piety, but the chairman of their little committee asked him, could he give them a toast that they could repeat on his behalf during the festivities. Of course, this was a dangerous thing to ask because, I love John Adams, by the way, because as a historian, you read Jefferson and Madison and Washington, whose writings I've spent a lot of time with, they can be very opaque. They don't necessarily tell you what you want to know. They tell you what they want you to know. But John Adams isn't like that at all. He tells you exactly what you want to know. He was a person who couldn't keep his mouth shut or his pen still, and they had to expect, this little committee, that John Adams might give them some elaborate speech. And in fact, one of the men present had gone with pen and paper to take down the toast. Now, let me tell you, 18th century toasts aren't like toasts that we're familiar with. Well, maybe, you go to a wedding and the best man will get up and ramble for a few minutes and that's a best man's toast. But we don't have any toasts in our society quite like 18th century toasts. They could go on at length. In fact, I see some of my friends in the Society of Cincinnati present. The Society, of course, has wonderful social events, and long, long ago made a convention that there would be only one toast, and it would be silent. It's to the memory of George Washington, which isn't silent. Sometimes I've seen men get up and, we'll now give the silent toast, and they'll talk for 5 minutes. But the general tradition is that it's a silent one. And that's because in the 18th century, toasts would go on and on and on and on. And sometimes they would be controversial and political and all sorts of things, and they didn't want that. But so the committee came to Adams' home prepared to take down at length a speech of some kind. And Adams looked at them and defied their expectations. He said, "I will give you the toast. Independence forever." They were a little astonished, and they went away, and they gave the toast, independence forever. And of the two responses to these invitations, to the two of the greatest of our founders, I find Adams to be the most elegant. Uncharacteristic in its brevity, but the most elegant because it grabs hold of what's most important about our revolution. What did our revolution achieve? I wrote a book about the American Revolution, general history of the American Revolution, if for no other reason than that I know what to say to people when they say, "What one book about the American Revolution should I read?" No, you ask somebody in the field, and I've spent my life studying the American Revolution in the 18th century since I was a boy. And somebody asks you one book. Well, that's like the silliest thing in the world. It's like, well, let me give you 10 or 15 you might start with. But eventually, now I have the one book I can tell you. Well, I can recommend one. And so it gets that monkey off of my back. But and in writing it, I found that the person that was most seductive to me over and over again, who answered my questions, was John Adams. But the backbone of this book is a contention. I said, what did the American Revolution accomplish? And that's why this book has the subtitle. It has the enduring importance of the American Revolution. What difference does it make? Why does it compel us to think about it today? What should we know about it? And of course, it is today a subject of some controversy, although I think those controversies are misguided, as are the people who answer them. They're misguided too, for reasons I hope I can illuminate a little bit. But we remember, and we ought to remember our revolution because it accomplished certain very concrete things. It achieved, and I'm going to unpack these, so I'm going to go through the list real quickly. Our independence, liberty, equality, natural and civil rights, and responsible citizenship under the rule of law. That's my list. That's what the introduction of the book says the American Revolution achieved, a society in which those things were honored and cherished, that they were the aspirations of American society from that moment forward. You'll notice there are things missing that you might have included on your list. Very deliberately so, thoughtfully so, I hope, like democracy. The revolutionaries mostly weren't very big on democracy. And by the way, democracy is not all it's cracked up to be. Democracy can be, there's the old joke. Democracy, it can be two wolves and a sheep. having a vote about what to have for dinner. Democracy is a way of resolving disputes and expressing consensus. It's a process. I think in the 20th century, and really only in the 20th century, we've come to refer to our country as a democracy, and when things aren't going well, we say something is a threat to our democracy. Well, democracy is an enormously important process in our way of life, but it is a process. It's not actually our ideal, I hope. That is, I think there are higher ideals, and independence, liberty, equality, natural civil rights, and responsible citizenship, that last one, what we're responsible for giving back to the society that nurtures and protects us. Those are, I think, are our highest ideals. Democracy is one of the processes by which we protect that. We nurture it. So when Adams said independence forever, he grabbed hold of the most important, the first of the great achievements of our revolution. Independence is a complicated thing. It isn't just independence from Great Britain. National independence. If it was just that, and actually it's one of the problems of people understanding the revolution today, is that independence from Great Britain, well, the connection to Great Britain doesn't sound so bad now, right? They've been our closest friend in the world for most of the last century. It's hard for us to imagine that what the Declaration of Independence says, that Britain is a tyranny led by a tyrant king. We regard that quietly, most of us, as hyperbole. It wasn't all that bad. Those of you who are nodding up and down, come see me at the end. I want to know if I change your mind in any way. Think about it a little differently. Britain was, without question, the freest place in the Western world on the eve of the American Revolution. But friends, that was not by any construction freedom as we understand it today. Not any. And our ancestors were right to call it a tyranny. They lived in one themselves, and so they knew what a tyranny was. But independence, it can be national independence, and that's what we'll celebrate with the fireworks and the flags and all the hoopla. It also is personal independence. And a lot of the people who fought in the American Revolution, who struggled, men and women, their goal was personal independence. They didn't want government telling them what to do, British or American. They didn't want a local grandee telling them what to do. They wanted a large degree of personal autonomy. And so it isn't just national independence, national autonomy, but personal autonomy that people were fighting for. And both Jefferson and Adams would have agreed with that. The reason I think Adams chose, when he said independence forever, independence as the central theme, his two-word toast for 1826, for the 50th anniversary of American independence, is it meant something even more to the people of New England, particularly this part of New England. People who had an extremely rich, at least by American standards, an extremely rich community life, and in which the life of the town meant an enormous amount. And as an outsider, I did go to graduate school in New England, but I haven't spent as much of my life in this part of the country as I should like. And if I live another life, I think I would live here. As I look out on you, and you look to me like a New England town meeting. And that's a good thing, by the way. No place else in America had anything quite like it. And it was, in its own way, a republic already on the eve of the American Revolution. I think one of the reasons that New England embraced the American Revolution wholeheartedly with both arms is that New Englanders had a better sense of what independence, autonomy, what a free society was or could be, more so than I think people anywhere else in America. And they enjoyed it, that life. And this is one of the ironies of the revolution, is they enjoyed it so much they were prepared to defend it. They recognized when it was threatened in a way that other people didn't. And so the freest people in America were the first to fight to be free, to broaden their freedom, because they knew what they stood to lose. And they had a taste, in the distance, in the dawn of a new time, they had a greater appreciation for what they could gain, for what the possibility of the future would be. Otherwise, it's hard to understand why people, the fat and happy farmers of South Shore, Massachusetts, well, why they embraced this revolution. They had it pretty good by the standards of the Western world, about the best that you can imagine. Trust me, I can't imagine anywhere else in Europe, for example, you would want to live. If you could live in Hingham, Massachusetts, you wouldn't choose any place on the continent of Europe in 1776. This was about the freest place in the world. That's why I'm happy to be with you all. Not that it's your fault, but you do live here. And you're the heirs and successors to that wonderful tradition. And long may it live. So I said, independence, liberty, equality, natural civil rights, and responsible citizenship, the great achievements of the revolution. But all in potential, all in aspiration. And in the beginning, all in principle. Of course, in the handwriting of our friend Thomas Jefferson, let's circle back to him. You all know these words, but I'm going to say them anyway, because I want you to think about them carefully with me for a few minutes. He says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which connect them to another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of God, nature, and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, and so on. We want to tell you what the reasons are we're going to separate. And then this astonishing, really is astonishing, that's the paragraph break. Oh, by the way, any teachers in the room? One of the first arguments I ever had with a teacher, and I may look smiling and nice, but I'm argumentative, was about this sentence. It was in 7th or 8th grade English composition, and she had written it up on the board. It was her example of a run-on sentence. Because the whole first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is one sentence, and I said, no, that's not a run-on sentence. There's nothing that you can cut out of it you can't cut it anywhere. It's not two sentences joined. It's one thought. When this is the situation, this is what you have to do, is all the sentence is saying. It's saying it in a very elaborate and complex way, and perhaps we could trim it down a little, but it's not. It's one complete thought. It's an amazing thought. And one of the first things you notice about it as the American Declaration of Independence is it doesn't mention America, doesn't mention the United States at all. That whole first paragraph. And indeed the next paragraph doesn't either. The United States, the colonies are not alluded to at all. This is, as Jefferson would have it, a statement of universal principle. It applies to all people in all times, in all places. That's why he uses this odd and a little bit, from a composition standpoint, clumsy phrase, human events. What other kind of events would we be talking about? So he's articulating a universal thing. And then this sentence, which begins actually just like a thunderclap, the next paragraph. One of the most interesting sentences in all of American letters, we hold these truths, right? And that one is, I think, I remember thinking about this as an editor once. I used to tell this to students. I said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which, important, among which, is not a limited list, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's a hesitancy, even in somebody as bold and determined as Jefferson, there's a hesitancy in this sentence. Because you could have ended the previous sentence and just picked up with, all men are created equal, and they are endowed, right? why does he have to feel like, why does he have to make this prefatory statement? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Don't you know when you're teaching people to write, you always say, never write, I believe, I think, right? We know you're writing it. We know you think that. Never say, I think such and such. I always would remember composite. I would tell students in class this. Well, that's all Jefferson is saying, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, we think this is true. And then he makes a true statement. All men are created equal. Well, even a man as confident as Jefferson knows that this statement is controversial. And he makes this really, I think, fascinating, wild claim that this truth that he's about to articulate is indeed self-evident. Now, that's a fancy term in philosophy. There is such a thing as the doctrine of self-evidence. It means that the thing can be proven internally without reference to external facts. You don't have to bring something else into the discussion. It proves, a proposition proves itself. Okay, let's throw away the fancy philosophy language for a moment. We hold these truths to be self-evident. There was never a truth ever uttered, I think, in Western history that was more self-evidently untrue than the claim that all people created, that's a hedge word there, but are equal. Inequality was the standard of the world when he wrote that. In fact, interestingly, and here we get our friend Adams back into the picture, in the draft of Jefferson's, of the Declaration, the surviving draft, I'm sure there were many drafts that got crumbled and thrown away, but there's a surviving draft in which Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And he's crossed that out, and he's written self-evident above that, along with other changes we know he made after he had conversation with Franklin and Adams, who were two of the other five-member committee and responsible for the Declaration. Of course, only Jefferson wrote it, but Franklin and Adams read drafts, and they advised him. And almost certainly, I think, there's a dispute about this, and I get into an hour-long argument with some people about who suggested to Jefferson self-evident. I think Adams did. There are people who think Franklin did, but it didn't come from Jefferson's pen. He wanted to say sacred and undeniable, and sacred and undeniable is easily denied, and sacred to whom is the response of the critic, right? I don't think it's sacred, and I can deny it. But when you say it is self-evident, you say it's a truth beyond dispute. That's what the claim is. But nothing was less true to the candid, open, and ordinary mind of the time, because it was a time of oppression and tyranny and darkness everywhere, even here. I say the freest place I know in the end of the 18th century. Women had no rights at all. There's half of the human race right off the top. Enormous numbers of people were enslaved, even here. Not as many here as elsewhere, but they were enslaved here. And there were all kinds of forms of unfreeness. Indentured servitude. Many people came to America as indentured servants in the 18th century, never lived out their indenture. The majority of white indentured servants that came here in the 18th century came as convicts, in fact, and were sold off by the state to serve as agricultural laborers. And most of them would die before their typically 14-year indenture ended. This was a world of grotesque unfreedom. We don't see that. We don't see that as easily, especially in wonderful communities like this, which have so many reminders of their 18th century past around all the time. Elegant reminders. We're sorry, I know this isn't an 18th century. Everything isn't an 18th century building, even though it look like it, but their elegance is surrounds us, and we think of the colonial world as being one of beauty and grace, and it was actually a world of terrible oppression for most of the people who lived in it. And ultimately, nobody was free in the way that we think of freedom, because even the wealthy, even well-to-do or sort of very comfortable folks. Benjamin Lincoln here in Hingham. Very comfortable folks. They were subjects of a king. And in the Revolutionary controversy, the controversy that began after the French and Indian War, the thing we all, had to memorize all the acts in opposition to them, right? The Sugar Act, the Townsend Duties, and so forth. All that opposition, the colonists argued, British polemicists argued back. The colonists lost that argument. Because in the end, the king was sovereign, and parliaments, which didn't operate, wasn't limited by any constitution, Parliament could, in fact, legislate for the colonies in any way it chose. And there were really no safeguards to speak of on the impositions that Parliament or the Crown or its officials could impose on the colonists. And in the end, the colonists realized this, and it's one of the reasons that people who are like Jefferson, who are really dedicated intellectually to the idea of abstract natural rights, of natural law, they become the sort of leaders of the revolution. Because we can't win on the grounds of claiming that these are the rights of Englishmen, because the Englishmen they've told us these aren't our rights, and frankly, we can't win that argument. We have begged the king to recognize, and that's what the Declaration says, we've begged him to recognize our rights, and he's ignored us. So ultimately, they have to rest their claim to liberty and independence and natural and civil rights on abstract rights, the rights of man, human rights, we've come to call them in the 20th century. And that's a huge sea change in the history of the world. Now, I insist, it was an aspiration uttered in the darkness in a society that was profoundly unfree. And what we celebrate, and what we should be celebrating next year, is not the achievement of American freedom, not the achievement of full independence. There's a deep meaning in Adam's toast, independence, but not just independence, isn't it swell, we achieved it, but independence forever, to recognize that guarding our independence, that fighting for it, protecting it, nurturing it, expanding it, is a goal of a free society. I talk a great deal to audiences of a conservative sensibility who like to think of the American Revolution as this moment in human history when people saw more clearly, more wisely, and founded more brilliantly than anybody has since, and that the goal of governance is to realize the aims of the founders. I never use that, by the way. If you read my book, and you get all the way to the end, and 360, 380 pages, I won't blame you if you don't. There's a little essay called A Note on Names, and a lot of critics have said, you should have put this in the front, warned us up front where we were headed. But I said that would be too inelegant. I said, one of the things I explain in it is, I said, nowhere in this book will you find the phrase founding fathers. And the reason for that is, and I don't know who those people are. I know who some of them are, we'd agree, that it's Jefferson and Adams and so forth, but I don't know what the limits of that are. And I also think it mischaracterizes our revolution, because our revolution was a popular movement. And when you go to war with the American Revolution, with the principle of the American Revolution, you're not going to war with Thomas Jefferson, who had feet of clay, or any of his brethren. You're going to war with regular American people, hundreds of thousands of them, who supported the American Revolution, who embraced the cause of those things: independence, liberty, natural and civil rights, responsible citizenship under the rule of law. They wanted to achieve those things, and for reasons that made sense to each of them. To disparage the American Revolution is to disparage a character I write about in the book, a real character. Some people think I'm talking about fictional people, but no. A black soldier named Jeffrey Brace, kidnapped from his home in what we would now call Mali, is taken first to Barbados, where he was beaten and starved, and in an effort to break him, his spirit, his self-worth, to enslave him, and then sold into slavery in Connecticut, where he was treated miserably for a decade before he was sold ultimately to a woman who had enough Christian charity. She taught him to read, and for her, she was a household servant, which was better way of life. It was still enslaved life. And then left him. She died and left Jeffrey to her son, who offered him his freedom in return for his service in the Revolutionary War. He joined the Continental Army and fought in the Continental Army for 5 years. And at the end of the war, he was indeed set free. And he said, the first day that I ever, what we would say, got a job, he got somebody to pay him wages for his labor, was one of the sweetest days of his life. He says, I could earn my own living and spend what I earned as I would. He says, I fought for 5 years for liberty as an enslaved person, but in the end I have achieved my liberty. He went off to Maine, and we only know his story because in extreme old age he'd gone blind. A young lawyer took down his story. Actually, one of the rarest known books about the American Revolution in its first edition, and for over 100 years, its only edition. There are only 2 known surviving copies of this book. Now it's widely available, but it's not Jefferson that you're flaying when you regard the American Revolution as some kind of episode of hypocrisy. It's Jeffrey Brace. There's a young woman named Margaret Corbin who her husband was a soldier in an artillery unit from Pennsylvania, and they were just married and they had nothing, and so she followed the army. A lot of women did, thousands of women in fact, followed the army into camp, cooked and sewed and nursed the sick, but she was hurt because her husband was with an artillery unit. Women had a peculiar, informal but pretty consistent role. When an artillery unit is in the field and it's firing in battle, somebody has to bring water from the rear to swab out the barrel, to cool the barrel between rounds. Otherwise, the next powder bag will be shoved in and it'll explode and things won't go so well. So you need a runner. You need somebody to bring you water. You also need somebody to bring you gunpowder up from the rear. You try to prevent having all the gunpowder right there near the cannon when you're firing. You've got it 100 yards off in the rear somewhere. And the women who followed artillery units tended to go into battle to help their husbands. And in battle in November of 1776, in the northern part of Manhattan Island, the battery was firing on approaching Hessian troops, and her husband was shot down and killed instantly. And she was at the gun at the time this took place, and so she picked up. He was the guy who had the swab, and on the other end, rammed home the charges. And so she picked up his instruments and began to serve the gun along with the other men who were in the unit. A few minutes later, she was hit with grape shot, which tore through her shoulder, her breast, and her jaw, almost took her jaw off. But she lived, and she went, she was captured, obviously, but they released her, released her, I assume, thinking that she was soon to die. She was taken to Philadelphia in a wagon. Americans took her to Philadelphia in a wagon, also expecting her to die at any moment. And she convalesced there for over a year, and was eventually taken to West Point, to what was at that point an important continental outpost. And she lived there for the remainder of her life, actually, until about 1800 she died. She was a young woman at the time of the Revolution, and from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, although the future of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania would have been unknown to anyone then. And what was she doing? This is a peculiar thing I think about. What was she doing? Why was she fighting? Why was her husband fighting? What did these people mean to get out of the American Revolution? It wasn't the pay, because the pay was at best irregular. They lived on the frontier of Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, which was kind of rough country in the 1770s, and they didn't drink tea. Paint, paper, those were taxed under the Townshend duties. Lead, tea, glass. Now, they didn't use any of those things. Maybe a little bit of lead for bullets. Those are all genteel luxuries in the 18th century. Paint, paper, lead, tea, and glass, taxed items. The glass and the lead are for windows, and fancy people have fancy windows, and so there's something there to tax. And of course, the tea is a genteel drink, and paper. That's except for paper to use for wadding when you ram home a bullet. Ordinary people didn't have much use for paper either. Those were luxury items, and I'm thinking Margaret and John Corbin didn't use much of any of those things. You see. But they were squatters in Pennsylvania on land they didn't own, and they could, if they chose, pick up and move to the frontier, as many people were at that time in Pennsylvania. What they wanted, it's not hard to discern, what they wanted was personal autonomy, independence. They didn't want anyone telling them what they could do or where they could go. What they owned was theirs. It might only be a gun, a rusty pot, a couple of chairs, but it was theirs. They didn't want a government telling them what they could do with what they owned, or taxing them heavily. They had never read Montesquieu or Locke or Rousseau. They weren't intellectuals. They weren't like our friends Adams and Jefferson, but they were all revolutionaries all the same. And our revolution was a revolution of enormous breadth and depth in American society. It wasn't just the founding fathers. It wasn't their accomplishment. I think one of the sad things about our upcoming anniversary, although we should celebrate our Declaration of Independence, is that we forget that this was the longest war in our history before these interminable Asian adventures of modern times, undeclared wars. Went on for 8 years. It touched every part of the country. It's easy to think of it as small, our Revolutionary War, because it didn't take as many lives as later wars, but as a proportion of the population, it took a larger percentage of the American population in casualties, losses, than any other American war except for our Civil War, and of course on that war, both sides count. So it's a little unfair. It reached every part of the country, and it spread sorrow and loss among countless American families. It was something not forgotten. A lifetime later, when Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, how he began, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent. And I know that countless people who hear that think our fathers brought forth, they're thinking about Jefferson and Adams, the founding fathers. That's not what Lincoln meant. His other writings make it pretty clear that what he meant when he talked about the people who achieved American independence were ordinary people, people like his own family who had fought in the Revolution. And our fathers were plain Americans. This was the great achievement of ordinary people, probably the greatest achievement of ordinary people in the entire history of the world, the achievement of American independence and ordered liberty. And we do them all a disservice by thinking only about our friends Adams and Jefferson and Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, as wonderful and important and as luminous in our history as those people are. A step down from them, somebody we wouldn't mistake for them as an intellectual, Benjamin Lincoln, I think comes closer to representing the American Revolution in its reality. Here, a person who had no personal stake in this thing, almost everything to lose by it. And I say, the people of this region, enormous amount to lose by it, and not so much apparently to gain given the level of risk involved in fighting a war against one of the world's great powers. These were people who were committed deeply to the cause of American freedom. And in the breadth and depth of their commitment, we have something of enormous importance to celebrate. And the best way that we can celebrate it is to work continuously to fulfill their aspiration that one day all Americans, and indeed all people everywhere, will be free. And that's what I have for you today. You're very kind, and I promised Deirdre I would take a few questions, and so I will.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. Any questions for today's speaker?
It could be silly, impertinent. I always tell people I edited the papers of George Washington, so if there's anybody who wants to ask about wooden teeth or dumb things like that, there's a good answer to just about everything. I'm not sure I have it, but there's a good one. No one. Yes.
Hold on a second. We have for our at-home audience. Thank you.
I was recently listening to something about our country's founding, and they talked about how, on some level, the Declaration of Independence was kind of a distilling of what had been said in the colonies prior, in town meetings, in churches, and this and that. And I was wondering, is that true? And then, with the primary source documents, do people like the couple that you mentioned from Pennsylvania, and Ben, if he was literate in writing at that time, do we have ideas of what they thought?
We do. Understanding that people of the revolutionary generation they're not like us, and they're certainly not like people of the Civil War generation. You read the letters, and people in the Civil War, they're romantics, capital R, and so they think a lot about themselves. They reflect on themselves a lot, what they think and feel, and they tell you those things. People in the 18th century are much more matter of fact, but you do get, letters and correspondence and places where people express hopes and ideals, commitment to high principles. They just aren't the elaborate high principles of, that someone as intellectually sophisticated as Adams or Jefferson would have, but they're not to be discounted because of that. Jefferson said modestly many times, he said that the Declaration of Independence was not anything original. He says, but rather it was an expression of the American mind. And he said the ideas in it were in common currency among educated people, and I derived ideas from Aristotle. He gave a list. Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke were the people he named in one of his letters as the sort of sources of the Declaration. But understand, Jefferson wrote the Declaration in a rented room in Philadelphia without access to any books. And so this was just one guy and a pen and some paper without the opportunity to refer to anything, as far as we know. And so, yeah, he was articulating his own thoughts, but the thing would have fallen dead at birth if it were just his thoughts. And that was what he was saying when he says reflection of the American mind. That being said, there is a great deal more intellectually going on there, as I suggest when my discussion of this idea of self-evidence. There's a lot more going on there than I think everybody in America in 1776 would have understood. But everybody who we can, you struggle a little bit. There aren't too many Jeffrey Braces. There were a lot of black soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Not very many of them wind up dictating a personal memoir at the end of their life and articulating their thoughts about what they had been through. And by comparison to later wars, the documentation is not as rich. But it is rich. I've spent my life in it, and if you can spend your entire life studying one episode in American history, there must be plenty to look at. But you don't have to get all the way down to the Mary and John Corbins and the Jeffrey Braces. You can look at people like, who do give you more, like Benjamin Lincoln, for whom, in particular, community meant a great deal. He would have been among those who would have understood Adams' toast, not as independence meaning national independence, independence meaning personal or individualism, but meaning community autonomy, the opportunity to come together, to build consensus among your friends and neighbors, that is also a form of independence. Peculiarly, I think, not peculiarly, but definitely distinctively that of the New England town.
I think we have one.
Hi. Many intellectuals in Massachusetts, politicians, ministers, people of that stripe, were convinced that the Massachusetts Charter that was issued in the late 17th century gave them legal rights that limited Parliament's authority over them, including the power to tax. Have you ever had a chance to look at that and come
Sure. They made that claim, and intellectually it's a strong claim, but the British denied it. Parliament insisted in its declaratory act that we have the right to legislate for the colonies, all of the colonies, including these recalcitrant folks in Massachusetts, in all cases whatsoever. And there had been a change in, broadly speaking, the British Constitution between the early 17th century and the late 18th century, and England was moving among my English history friends, this is a point of controversy, but I say it anyway. England was moving in the late 18th century in the direction of absolutism. That is, it wasn't France, but it was becoming more like France. And partly it was, the post-revolutionary imperial reforms that lead to the American Revolution, is an attempt to bring order to the empire. The empire had always been very disorderly, and going back to the Charter of Massachusetts, the other colonial charters, which seemed to the colonials to give them certain rights and liberties, but the British were changing the game. They were making a sovereign claim. Yeah, they might have conceded. Well, yeah, you have that thing, but we can always change that. We are sovereign. The king in Parliament is sovereign, and so your chartered rights are not, they're not permanent if we decide they're not. And therein lies the difference.
Yeah, just one comment. That goes right back to the covenant, too.
Absolutely.
Because in Massachusetts, the covenant was the beginning and the end, and that covenant included the charter. And once you breach the charter, you breach the covenant, and we're off. Goodbye.
Right, and that principle, that covenanting principle is distinctive to New England, but is Americanized. I mean, the Declaration of Independence parallels that. All of our constitutions do. When at the end of the thing, essentially the people who are authors, who are in a legal sense, all of the people voting for it, sign it to make law, to make fundamental law. They say we the undersigned. That we the undersigned business that's a New England church covenant. That's a dissenting church covenant. That's where that idea comes from, and so in a lot of ways, our whole constitutional history is covenants writ large.
One here, and then we're going to take one online.
Jack, if you'll forgive me for circling back to the first question in a sense, would you not agree that Jefferson, in his room without his books, still had the pre-declaration experience of the committees of correspondence and all those missives from New England town meetings that expressed many of these issues, and many of them eloquently, in the thousands, and which were all, in a sense, directed at the Continental Congress, and certainly Adams and Jefferson would have been, Adams and Franklin would have been quite familiar. So I would suggest that there was, in fact, certainly not the internet and certainly not, the journals that we have in our age, but there was a pipeline of local popular opinion that did reach them.
Absolutely. I mean, the short answer, I'm not given to short answers, Arch, is yes. Is absolutely yes. I mean, Jefferson and Adams in particular had been living and breathing this controversy for several years. And the flow of ideas, I mean, Jefferson is not, I think it's not simply a modest brush off when he says, well, this is an expression of the American mind. Well, that's where the American mind is expressing itself, in just those petitions and addresses and correspondence being received. He'd seen enough in it that he didn't need something at his right hand while he was writing. But he knew the sentiments of Americans. And I think it does injustice to our declaration to suggest that, and I don't mean to suggest that this is the arid abstraction of Thomas Jefferson. It isn't. I think he's right in that it is the expression of the will of an enormous number of the American people. It comes as a shock to many, but it is an expression of the collective will of the American people at that moment.
Thanks. We have one online, and then we'll take one more here.
From our Zoom audience, thank you so much for acknowledging the aspirational nature of our revolutionary writing, and for pointing out that the elites could not fight without others. Except for George Washington in the Army, how much did leaders such as Adams and Jefferson interact with the average people you credit?
Well, it varies. The like of those two, a great gulf is fixed. Jefferson was in many ways a very abstract and doctrinaire intellectual. As I tried to frame when I began, his response to an invitation to come to 4th of July celebration comes in a letter from somebody he doesn't know, and he replies to it in a very formal letter. Jefferson doesn't have as much intimate correspondence with the people that Jefferson, all his career, talks about a great deal. But Adams, and here you all live within a few miles of Adams' home, Adams interacts with ordinary people all the time, all of his life, and of course is a family man, and therefore is tied in with all sorts of other people that he sees intimately all the time, whereas Jefferson, by contrast, is not. Wife dies young. He doesn't have much of a family life, Jefferson, after he's a young man. And so it varies a great deal. And certainly, one of the greatest of that generation, most important of that generation, Washington, is one of the things that sets Washington apart from other leaders of his generation is that Washington had a sort of very intimate, regular interaction with what I would call ordinary people, both as a militia leader, very active militia leader, not just somebody who was a colonel by courtesy like George Mason was, as a surveyor. All the things that had in Washington's early life had put him in contact on a regular basis with some very, very ordinary people. And he was able to he spoke their language. He interacted with them effectively. And then when he was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the men that he surrounded himself with and that he valued the most were not necessarily the most aristocratic or the most the wealthiest and most powerful. Some of those he liked and he got along with well. Philip Schuyler, for example, a very wealthy New York grandee. But Washington, who was, somebody help me. In my old age, I start to forget things. The wonderful colonel, later brigadier, who from Marblehead. There you go. Knox is a unique and special case, and Greene too. But I think Glover illustrates that. Here's like a rough and tumble guy who is, but incredibly effective because as a sea captain he is used to giving tough men orders and seeing those orders obeyed. And Washington, for all that he's a sort of a Virginia gentleman of the 18th century, Washington really was attached to those men. And Greene is another one. Knox becomes one and Knox is one of the most preposterous characters of the American Revolution. Oh, he's wonderful. I mean, but you write a screenplay and you got this, this guy, and the producers in Hollywood are going to reject it as this is not a believable character. And we have part of the reason is we get these portraits of these men when they're old. I say old, but I can say that I am among you. That is, I would have, if I were George Washington, I would have already sat for Gilbert Stuart several times by the age I am now. And people would remember me as an older guy. But Washington was 42 when he took command of the Continental Army. And of course, we all shake our heads about Lafayette, 19 and a major general in the Army. By the way, Washington shook his head at that too, until he got to know him. But Knox is like this. I mean, barely out of his teens, with his finger blown off because he's, playing with a gun or a cannon, and comes up with this. We need cannon. I can get them for you. And then the movement of the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Dorchester, which is it's one of the great epics in American history, one of the great epics in Western history. Great story of the war in which no one dies, which is wonderful. Washington came to value those people more than the fancy, the gentry, I don't use the word elite myself, but we know of whom we're talking. And she wouldn't let us forget her.
So the question I had was more along the non-military leaders, right? So when you talk about unsung heroes of these ideals of the revolution, is there anybody that jumps out that either during or after the war that really pushes this forward?
I think I missed the very beginning of your question, being partly deaf and.
Yeah, sorry, I was just saying the non-military leaders, so the people that were part of the whole concept and the Congress, and the war starts, and the leaders, the military leaders you just went through, Knox and others, obviously well known, very important to the outcome. But for the ideals of what it wanted to accomplish, were there any non-military leaders that stuck out that weren't of the founding fathers?
You could point to several, but I think the one I would point to first is the most popular political leader of the American Revolution. And I know everybody in the room is going, who's the most popular political leader of the American Revolution? It is without question, no reasonable debate, Patrick Henry. Elected first governor of Virginia when Virginia declared its independence and framed its own constitution. Virginia's constitution, by the way, I live in Virginia, and Virginia's constitution has, since the Revolution, forbid anyone from succeeding themselves. You can serve as governor repeatedly, but you only get to serve one term, and then you have to go out and somebody else can come. Patrick Henry was elected. The next guy came in, he was elected. He sort of skipped a term because he had to. He was by far the most popular politician of his generation because he interacted regularly with ordinary people and spoke their language, and he spoke to them, and his eloquence was directed to them. Henry, by the way, was not as unlearned as some of his detractors would have you believe, but he didn't use Latin quotations and flowery language. He spoke in an idiom that people understood, the rhetoric and cadences of the Bible, and he was a continuous advocate of the rights of ordinary people in Virginia, which, by the way, in the generation of the American Revolution, the biggest group of dissenters aren't people who are, at first, people who are concerned about British tyranny. They want religious freedom. The Baptist and Methodist denominations were growing extremely quickly in Virginia on the eve of the American Revolution. And those people were oppressed and tyrannized by the Anglican establishments. Baptist ministers were beaten. Some were indeed, we don't use this term lightly in the 18th century, some indeed were tortured, constantly imprisoned for preaching without license, and the licenses were not easily obtained. And these people were outraged, and Patrick Henry was their champion. And freedom for them, as it was for many people in the 18th century, meant religious freedom. And not surprising that among the great achievements of our revolution is the establishment of religious liberty, because that was the thing that was most important to an enormous number of people. And the politicians, political leaders, non-military leaders who had their ear to the ground, who understood that, as Patrick Henry did, were enormously successful. Patrick Henry was the only person in American politics, I'm convinced, that George Washington feared. For good reason. I mean, Henry very nearly by himself defeated the ratification of the Constitution in Virginia, ratified by just a very few votes in a very large convention in which he spoke over and over again and eloquently. And of course, poor Madison, all 5'2", and Madison spoke barely above a whisper. He was no orator, had to contend as best he could against Patrick Henry, which is David and Goliath. Henry would be the most important, but there are others, a lot of others, and particularly, a lot of popular politicians in Pennsylvania, for example, who represented sort of what we would call sort of working class people, tradesmen, and who understood their aspirations and saw how the ideals of the revolution dovetailed with them. I did an essay. I'd say one of my favorite essays I ever wrote, if I can be vain and say what I like, something else I wrote. I wrote an essay about a Philadelphia craftsman named, the most absurd name, I think. His name was Plunkett Fleeson. See, the name makes you laugh. I remember the first time I read this name 30 or 40 years ago, I said, I have to write something about this guy, just because he has a fun name. And his profession, of course, helped. He was an upholsterer. And so I wrote this essay, Plunkett Fleeson, Revolutionary Upholsterer, which sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit to me. But he was the leading, he made upholstered chairs, fancy wing chairs for well-to-do people. And an upholsterer was actually kind of also an interior decorator. He would come into your home and decide, well, you need draperies, and by the way, we're going to make the upholstery the same as the draperies, and it's all very elaborate. Often the most expensive things in your house was upholstery. He served very well-to-do clients, and you would think that a person like that who served the well-to-do clients is a very unlikely revolutionary, right? I mean, unless all the well-to-do clients are radicals, and they weren't, in Pennsylvania, particularly in Philadelphia, which is a hotbed of loyalism. But Fleeson came to regard the revolution, and he left us behind an interesting array of papers of various kinds and business records. He regarded the revolution as a kind of declaration of American cultural independence, that he didn't have to be slavish in what he did, always aping British fashions and British styles. Everything didn't have to come out of Thomas Chippendale's style guide, that America wasn't necessarily a cultural outpost of Britain, that it was mature enough that it could stand on its own. And he was a man of popular culture, of high culture, really, of a certain kind. And he was dedicated, as much as any craftsman in Philadelphia, to the goals of the American Revolution, leaders of all kinds of committees. And it was about independence, but a certain kind of independence. For him, oddly and interestingly, kind of cultural independence. We don't have to do everything like them. We don't have to be slaves to British fashion. America is a mature cultural outpost, perhaps, of the Western world, but he was very proud of it. So you see in the careers of all kinds of people, whether they're religious radicals or revolutionary upholsterers, reasons why the revolution resonates with them. Otherwise, it doesn't succeed. And to talk continuously about leaders, about the Jeffersons and the Adamses and the Hamiltons and so forth, Leaders only matter if people follow them. Otherwise, they're just a guy out taking a walk, right? And they have to speak in a way, they have to articulate goals and ideas and aspirations that resonate with ordinary people. Otherwise, nobody follows them.
Fantastic, and a perfect segue. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Y'all are very kind and very tolerant.
Thank you so much. And talk about the every person. In 3 weeks, we will gather here again. So I hope to see you all on Sunday, October 5th, for the next lecture in our series, which is Dr. Zara Anashanlin, and she's visiting us from the University of Delaware. You can see a copy of her new book, The Painter's Fire, which is in our museum shop on the first floor. And included in her discussion in The Painter's Fire are the portraits we have in the ballroom from Prince Dima of Henry and Christian Barnes. So a perfect segue from your wonderful remarks. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our board of directors, many of whom are here today, and in particular Jim and Bob for introducing our program today and our speaker, and all of the members of our program committee and volunteers, Ruth and Judith and Mary downstairs, and Scott, who greeted you at the front door, and anyone I'm forgetting, I apologize, but I couldn't do it without the committee support. And please join me downstairs for refreshments and a chance to meet Jack Warren. And again, thank you all for your support of the Society, and hope to see you back here. Oh, one quick note, because we love Henry Knox, and it is an incredible story, is we're fortunate to have join us today Jonathan Lane from Revolution 250. Can you give a wave, Jonathan? Thank you. As many of you know who attended Lincoln Day last February, Jonathan has fearlessly led Massachusetts history organizations and historic sites and museums and national parks for the last 5+ years in our commemoration efforts. A tireless, literally weekly job. And next big event is honoring Knox's artillery train from Ticonderoga across Massachusetts to Dorchester Heights. So please have a chance to say hello to Jonathan. Stay tuned for information about how you can join in the commemoration of the Knox artillery train. And certainly next March 17th, in addition to St. Patrick's Day, is Evacuation Day, so, and the 250th anniversary. So a great setup for us to remind everybody that we are in the commemoration. So please join me again in thanking Jack Warren for kicking off our series. And please join us downstairs.